Thanks. And off the back of two very impressive PowerPoint-assisted presentations, I've not got a PowerPoint. Feeling quite naked. I did write some notes, but I feel like the conversation has surpassed them, so I'm freewheeling here. So if anybody feels like the conversation has been too structured and stuff so far, this could well be the presentation for you. Sorry, my name is Charlie Winstanley. I think I've been invited here on the basis that I've recently published a book with Bristol Uni Press called Bricking It, which is on the UK housing crisis and failure of policy. Previously, I worked as a political advisor to a local authority mayor in Salford, Paul Dennett, who also works as Andy Burnham's deputy at Greater Manchester and holds the housing planning and homelessness portfolio at Greater Manchester. And I was quite heavily involved as a co-writer in the first iteration of the 2019 Greater Manchester Housing Strategy. So the book that I wrote was very much based in my experiences and frustrations of moving into that role with Paul with a very clear agenda to build truly affordable housing for Greater Manchester residents. And as we were speaking about in the previous session, that's in the context of a lot of the opposite going up in Greater Manchester and a lot of the city of Greater Manchester being transformed in very much the opposite direction. And it was based in my experience working and being very committed within that role to trying to deliver and coming up against a totally dysfunctional system of UK housing policy and really trying to unpick mentally what's actually happened here that's made the state, local government so much less effective at hitting some of these targets than it used to be. So really glad that Beth was able to present before on the rent controls, and I thought there was a really interesting graph there which I think started in 1962 showing the average income of an average household spent on rent from 1962, and you see kind of hovering just under the 10% mark. So what my book actually does is goes back a little bit further and finds that although it's true to say that today's house prices are very, very historically expensive, what is also true to say is that that period, 1962, basically from the 1950s through to the 90s as a period of housing affordability, was historically quite affordable. And particularly that post-war period up to the sort of the 70s. And prior to that, housing affordability as a sort of a proportion of people's incomes was actually higher, not quite as high as it is in some places today, but still substantially higher than it got to in that low point, and it was retained for that sustainable period. There's ups and downs, it goes back and forwards. But basically what my book does is try and chart three different pillars of what you actually call a housing crisis. Because I guess my thesis is that that period of history, which I think a lot of us refer back to as our kind of benchmark for normality, it's the boomer generation period where our parents grew up, or my parents grew up, and were able to afford house, and the general period of widespread affordability of tenure, was actually a fairly historical aberration. If not purely on affordability terms, then there are three pillars I describe in the book on the housing crisis. So one of them is affordability, another is availability, and the last one is quality. So there is one particular exception in terms of the affordability question from the 19th century, which I think is worth warranting. That is that the average income spent on rents in cities in the UK plummeted in around the 1840s, got very, very low. Still probably not much lower than it was in the 60s, but very low historically. That correlates with the 1848 revolutions and a lot of social commentary from that time of absolutely appalling urban conditions in urban centres around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Conditions so appalling that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we created veritable hellscapes which horrified contemporaries. Effectively, this is the era that Dickens is referring to in things like Christmas Carol and on Oliver Twist. It's the era of rookeries in London, rabbit warrens, of falling down houses. These are the East End slums where Jack the Ripper stalked his victims, where people were living next door to dung heaps, where they were literally piling their sewage out into courtyards outside, where mass cholera epidemics were rife. And actually at one point in the 1840s, life expectancy within the cities of Manchester and Liverpool is actually recorded as dropping as low as 25 years old for about a 3 or 4 year period, primarily related to disease. And I think that life expectancy drop is particularly significant, given that at the very same time we're seeing an increase in life expectancy generally, we're seeing a decrease in infant mortality, and we're seeing increase in medical conditions. So the conditions which were created in urban centres in that period were so bad that they counteracted in those areas the overwhelming progress which was being made in terms of life expectancy and public health. So moving back onto the question here, which is what policies can we bring in that sort of are an alternative to letting the developers get what they want? Well, I suppose I don't want to be too negative on it, but I suppose one of the theses behind the book that I've written is that we created a very unusual historical period in the mid-20th century, very unusual in that we managed to sustainably create or practically universal access to decent quality and sustainably improving quality of housing at historically affordable levels. We managed to sustain this for quite a long period. And I would argue that this was built, the sustainable period of housing, of this period, was predicated on some massive transformations of primarily of the British state, but also particularly around the structure of finance as well around the time. So to start with the state, I think towards the latter end of the 19th century, the Victorian social reformers really start to legislate into power what we now kind of recognise as some of the modern functions of a local council. This is when they really start to come into force in terms of enforcing public health and planning. And this is where you start to see the slum clearances as well. And actually the first council houses that start to be built towards the end of the 19th century as well. And this is part of a public health mission primarily to preserve the public health of the population, which was suffering so poorly under the conditions which had been created. So you start to see, I think, as a reaction against this early industrial urbanism, this movement around developing the powers of councils, which then starts to get formalised and almost becomes an ideological process with the Garden City movement. And again, it's linked into Victorian philanthropy and a lot of the pre-built towns, and there's a lot of idealism around this idea about planning and the idea that you can plan entire communities and get rid of these ills of squalor and disease. And a lot of these principles become established in British planning policy with the Tudor-Walters report, which I think was around sort of 1920. And that's when you start to see a lot of what we now recognise as sort of key planning designs in terms of housing spec, like, for example, allowing light penetration into rooms and making sure that you've not got single skin brick walls and various different other regulations which now kind of moderate in terms of the quality of houses being built. This is the Tudor-Walters report, which then morphs into the first iterations of the Town and Country Planning Act in the 1920s, which then ultimately is really formalised in the 1945 post-war Labour Town and Country Planning Act as a huge revolutionary document which effectively nationalises the right to land, requiring for the first time would-be developers to access permission, which is democratically controlled via what we now have as in terms of our planning committees. This is where the concept of democratic and community scrutiny over planning gets instituted in the 1945 Act. And I think that coming back to what the sort of the conversation we're having today, I think that's the thing which is coming under flack now from the developer community. And there's some other very interesting things which happen which manage to preserve this era of low rents and low housing affordability. I think Beth was talking about rent controls. Rent controls, when they first introduced in the First World War, saw an immediate, pretty much, I think, off the top of my head, don't quote me, about a 15% decline in the rental value and rental prices. And then those rent controls are kept in place pretty much consistently all the way through to the, I've forgotten the name of the 80 Act, the Assured Tenancy Act, which I'm sure we all know about. But the rental controls basically are in place for the vast majority of the 20th century and are helping to suppress price rises, and particularly in the rental sector. And they also prevent the growth of the private rental sector. So the private rental sector itself contracts and then never really recovers. It's kind of pressed down to about 10% of the tenure market as a total, and it's held there for a very, very long period of time. It only really starts to recover in the 90s. So you've got rent controls, But then you've also got the way that houses were being financed. So the modern residential housing mortgage, as we have today, with a sort of 30 to 35-year payment period, this was actually a bit of a fiscal innovation which occurred in the 1920s during the Liberal government's cheap money period. And it was invented effectively by the building societies, who at that time had effectively a monopoly over residential mortgage lending. So they controlled pretty much the entirety of the mortgage market in that period of time. There's a really interesting backstory in terms of the development of building societies and how they emerged as mission-driven organizations with a very heavy influence from Christian, Quaker, and nonconformist sort of Christian traditions, very much dedicated as a moral mission to improving the lot of the working class and working class lives. And these organizations, held together with this moral mission, established themselves effectively as a sole source of credit for new house building for working class people. And in the 1920s, they start to innovate with their model. And that's when you get, for the first time in history, a situation where the average monthly mortgage payment drops below the average rental payment on a monthly basis. So that's when you start to get a situation where it becomes financially sensible and viable for even a working class person on a relatively low income to start considering a mortgage, to start considering home ownership. Now, some of the really interesting things about the way that building societies operated their monopoly over mortgage lending. So for most of the period up until financial deregulation in the late 70s and 80s, they used to operate a cartel. Some people may remember this, and they used to restrict the rate of lending on an annual basis precisely to avoid house price inflation. And so what you would have to do is you would apply for the bank for a mortgage and you had to queue. And people used to have to wait years, several years, until it was their turn in the queue. And actually, it was deemed that the amount of money which had been lent out was requisite for them. And this was quite consciously a process which was employed to prevent concurrent house price inflation. Now, what happens in the late 70s when you get financial deregulation is that international banks, who had previously kind of been split into different types of lending, used to have specialist business lenders. The building societies were specialist mortgage lenders. You'd have investment banks, which were much more about kind of international lending. They all start to merge at an international scale, and those international banks move in, monopolize, and eat up your building societies. And there's some really interesting research from Josh Ryan Collins of UCL, who's assessed how mortgage lending itself has become one of the key drivers of annual house price inflation. He points out that whereas in the 1980s, I think in 1980 itself, the average bank spent about 80% of their lending was on business lending towards businesses and only 20% on mortgages. Today, that's flipped opposite, the reverse. 80% on mortgage lending, 20% on business lending. So you can go, again, referring back to the conversation we were having earlier today about the model of finance and how that's all coming together. We can start to see how this huge amounts of money now is being invested into mortgages. And effectively, banks are now betting on persistently increasing house prices. And not only they're betting on them, they have the means to ensure that the amount of money which they're lending out in the mortgages is enough to cover the annual house price inflation which they have caused themselves and to continue the cycle. So we've got very baked in inflation, I think, into the system now, partly because of the way that it's been financed. And probably most significantly, there's lots of other factors, but most significantly, of course, in terms of creating and maintaining this era of relative stability in houses and house prices and improvements to quality and tenure is mass council house building. So, as was mentioned in the previous session, and Anna mentioned it as well in her presentation, councils used to build pretty much 50% of all new builds. If you go from 1945 through to the end of the 70s, it's about 50%. If you look at it as it sort of tails off, it becomes a third towards the end of that period. But that capacity, that building capacity, when it drops out of the market in the early 80s following the introduction of right to buy, it's simply never replaced. And one of the really interesting things is that private house building completions haven't actually dipped that much since in that time. It's relatively stable. The big differential here is the absence of councils. And it has to be said that in terms of going back to Labour's 1.5 million house target figure, that roughly works out at 300,000 homes a year over the course of a 5-year parliament. And that is I can't actually find where there was a methodology that they ever used to calculate that figure, but if there is one, I imagine it would be that 300,000 units a year is roughly the amount of units which was being built during that period in the post-war era, where we built so many new homes and completely transformed our physical realm. So, moving back to the question again, I suppose I do have some quick and easy policy suggestions, which I think we could introduce tomorrow and I think would have a positive impact. But I suppose one of the big overarching things I wanted to convey is that I don't think a lot of the issues that we're facing now can be solved, however dedicated, by local councillors with a current array of financing and powers. I don't think they can be solved with particular policy fixes. I think what is actually required, if we're to think about the historical precedent of recreating possibly the only period that you might call housing plenty in human history, is nothing less than a complete refashioning of the state and its role within society and the economy, and as part of that, a transformation of the financial system as well. So, quite a big ask. So, like I say, I don't, I'm not shying away from the task with that, I have to say. You know, I think it is possible. We've shown that it's possible. We've shown that we can do it. But as a cautionary tale, what I would say is that it was 2 world wars which precipitated that gargantuan change in the first instance. And I don't think it would be completely unrealistic to suspect that it might take something on the scale of that kind of catastrophe to precipitate similar political action again in the future, although I dearly, dearly hope that that's not the case. That said, to move on to slightly more optimistic roundup on my key policies that I think we could introduce tomorrow, which would be great. Rent controls, fantastic, yes, makes sense, they would work. In addition to rent controls, one thing that I would say is that the current Renters Reform Act, which has been resuscitated by the present Labour government, which was actually Michael Gove's Act originally, which was canned towards the end of the last Tory administration, I think they've actually took a lot of steps towards developing the infrastructure which you might be able to use to, for example, control rents. But I think they've gone all around the houses in order to do so, creating an ombudsman, tribunal, all sorts of different things. All of this could have been shortcut by simply introducing mandatory landlord licensing. It is illegal to own a dog without a license in the United Kingdom today. I do not see why it should not be illegal to own a house where human beings are expected to live in and not be licensed. If you introduce licensing, by default, you also introduce the powers and the fining responsibilities to make these effectively self-financing. Where you have limited landlord licensing areas at present, they often are self-financing through the fines. It's a perfectly achievable policy, would be much simpler, and actually creates the framework again through which you could very simply move forward to establish rent controls proper, potentially more along the lines of the way that they used to be in. Here, I will actually refer back to my notes from originally, because I think I do have some more good ideas for things to say here. Council housing. The biggest issue facing council housing in terms of ramping up production now. I would have said right to buy a few years ago, but I actually don't think that's the case. I think that the biggest issue, I think today, is that if you were to finance council houses with the current costs of construction and the current costs of borrowing, purely from private borrowing, without subsidy, those houses will never pay off the cost of borrowing. Ever. This has been modelled many, many times now, and particularly over the last 5-10 years, the costs involved in construction have rendered it impossible without state subsidy to build and sustainably fund the creation of new council housing units without state subsidy. So the subsidy question needs to be fixed. If you fix the subsidy question, if you fix the financial black hole in the economics of building council houses, you combine that with getting rid of right to buy, and you combine that with some more muscular land assembly powers on behalf of local authorities. Between those three policies, you could unleash the capacity of local councils to build houses at scale once again. But that's no easy task. And I think one of the key elements behind actually doing this work is understanding the key interdependencies between different areas of the public estate. Because it's not actually just councils that save money over the long run from having people sustainably homed in council housing. It's the healthcare service, it's the police, it's the entire public estate and the Treasury through the reduction in housing benefit receipts. All of these organisations benefit, and being able to understand how this knits together into a financial package, I think, is key. And there are people working on this right now. It's very interesting work, very complicated, but if they nail it, it could be the thing that really opens up the potential there. I think we also need to recognise that there are huge, big problems here which still need to be overcome. We have a shortage of nearly 250,000 construction workers in the UK right now. So the shortage is only going to increase. This again is primarily due to the short-termism of the volume developers who have been monopolised most of our housing production, well, for a lot of the century, but particularly since the 2008 financial crash when SMEs collapsed out of the market. Volume developers have basically, who in this country are often not single corporate entities, they're often sitting atop, they're effectively commissioners of multiple areas of subcontracting, which often go down dozens and dozens of times before you actually hit some money being spent on someone going on site. These organisations are far too fractured to have a long-term perspective on simple things like workforce planning, and as a result, the crisis in terms of the workforce means that unless there is some kind of gigantic leap forward in modern methods of construction, we don't actually have the workers to build these houses anyway. So all of this becomes a bit of an academic point unless we start to get ahead of that workforce planning argument. The value of land has been referenced here, and I think going back to the question about what do developers want, there's a question here, what do developers actually want? Because I think they often focus on the planning system because that seems to them to be the easiest part of their fixed costs for them to change through political pressure. But it's not the biggest fixed cost that they have, and it's certainly not the component of fixed costs which has risen the fastest for them over the last decade or so. If you look, as Beth's graph showed before, the relative increasing cost of land for developers has massively increased. The relative cost of labour, partly because of workforce shortages, and also the relative cost of materials because of general price inflation, has hugely increased. But developers are constantly focused on the planning system. Why? It's because they believe that the planning system can fold under political pressure, whereas they have no faith about being able to reform the rest of the system. The truth is, if we want affordable housing, the other fixed costs which have been growing in the system are the real things which need to change. And as well, I think, just to finish as well, I think ultimately a lot of this, I do believe, increasingly comes down to the financial system, and this is the hardest nut to crack, because we're now so invested in this model of growth, we're so invested in this particular social form and the level of debt which we've accrued, and so many individuals are now, as has been relayed throughout the course of the previous session, personally reliant on the levels of debt which and value which is now accrued within property, that if you simply crash the housing market, 20-year-old me would have been very angry with me for talking about avoiding crashing the housing market. I would have been very much in favour of crashing the housing market. Now I actually think it would be a disaster. I think that for whatever value you might wipe off the housing stock, you would also wipe so much value out the rest of the economy that the relative reduction in people's spending power wouldn't enable them to actually pick up the tab. And I think you would be more likely to end up with millions of empty homes and millions of people on the street than you would be to find all of those people back in those homes in the way that it actually works out. So I think that actually there's a process here about avoiding the cataclysmic cliff edge which could come from crashing the housing market. I think that rent controls is one option to be able to sustainably start to cap inflation. I think building council houses on regulated rents is another way, and increasing that stock to a point in which it has a big bearing on the wider market is another way in order to gradually. But also I think we really need on an international level, and this requires international cooperation, to really start thinking about the international financial situation here, because frankly it's out of control. So sorry, there we go.